Commissioner Fuller, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Andrew.
Wanted to ask you first about the biggest story over the last year, I guess the pandemic. You've been in the middle in New South Wales while you've had the Treasurer and Chief Health Officer duking it out on either side of the health and economic arguments here. New South Wales gets credit as being stronger than the rest of the nation in opening up the economy, but I know that some have felt the restrictions have been too harsh and that health has too much power. Kerry Chan has too much power. What would you say to that?
Look, for mine, I've had the privilege of sitting through many cabinet crisis meetings, and I think it has been such a healthy debate around balancing public health and the economy. And I think early in the piece that the health, people were probably winning the argument, and that was probably right looking back in time. But certainly you look around the table now with Minister Perrottet and Victor Dominello and Treasury members and economists, that there are more people who have concern with the economy around the table now than there are health people. And I think that's a great sign in terms of not just New South Wales today, but going forward the next 2 or 3 years. I think the real strength of the Premier's leadership won't be known until 2 or 3 years' time, when the economic damage plays out across Australia.
How soon can you get all your officers vaccinated, and is that something that you'd push for?
Yeah, look, absolutely I will, particularly given the closeness we have in the hotel operation. We've been running that since March. We've had 130,000 Australians returning into New South Wales, and we're proud of those numbers. We're running a low-risk operation, not a zero-risk operation, because clearly people who are coming into this country do have the virus, and that is a consistent number that we see, Andrew. So I would certainly like to see those frontline police vaccinated, as early as possible.
And the Ruby Princess inquiry, obviously you turned that into a criminal inquiry. Where's that at?
So that still is underway. Detective Chief Inspector Dickerson still leads that. As I said at the start, is that this is going to take some time, over 2,000 potential witnesses, and then the challenges, of course, of the ship and the crew and the doctors who are all now back in different countries. So not an easy investigation, but nevertheless the information that we collected was extremely important to the Special Commission of Inquiry, and that was recognised by Mr Brett Walker.
Do you think there could never be charges on that front? Is there that prospect?
I won't say no. I will say it has been a complex investigation, given the nature of the fact that that this may have happened outside of waters, Australian waters. So there are so many complications in the investigation, but I still believe, in terms of what my role is to honour to the people of New South Wales, that we do our best to get to the bottom of any criminal aspects. And if we don't, then we still have achieved enormous assistance to the Special Commission of Inquiry, and we will assist the coronial process in relation to that. So I don't see it as a wasted operation.
So you think it could be a coronial inquest? That's on the cards.
I think that's certainly possible. We have deaths as a result of the virus, and of course that is ultimately up to the coroner. But it's not exactly the type of matter, if the coroner makes a decision to have an inquest, that we can go back in time.
I wanted to talk a bit about the nature of organised crime that is being encountered in New South Wales. Various shootings. A recent report spoke about 3 separate underworld feuds, which have resulted in 5 people shot dead and the attempted murder of 3 others in the past 6 months. What's going on?
Organised crime, particularly transnational organised crime, is and probably the greatest challenge to law enforcement at the moment, and that ranges from drug turf fights right through to terrorism. And we know from the Australian government's perspective, intelligence agencies would say that 70% of the heads of these organisations live overseas in countries that perhaps we don't do business with as a government, which makes it extremely challenging. And then you double down on that with the use of technology like the dark web and encrypted currencies that are new and emerging, is that I'd say to you that there's no crime type that has ever moved quicker and evolved quicker than transnational organised crime is.
Encrypting currencies, do you mean Bitcoin, that sort of thing?
Yes.
That's how they do business?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm interested in this notion of what you just spoke about, overseas principles directing crime in Australia. How does that work? How's that different from how it used to be?
Look, in the old days, the criminal groups lived and operated and they maintained their turf. But now geographical boundaries are not there, and that's somewhat technology enabled in the fact there's encrypted phones and the use of the internet, and again different types of currencies that are impossible to track at the moment. It's an enabler, Andrew, but it's not just what we face today, but this is evolving every day. There's a new encryption technology that we have to try and work out how to break to protect the people of New South Wales. So what does that mean? We're always going to need beat police, right? There will always be two blues protecting the people of New South Wales, but we're hiring data scientists, we're hiring postgraduate kids who have degrees in computer science. So there's a whole new generation of civilian police officers that are in back rooms fighting fire with fire.
Do you have concerns about a second casino in Sydney and the prospect of that feeding organised crime?
The reality is organised criminals have to wash their money somewhere. We know that during COVID, particularly during the difficult lockdown period, that we were finding low-level dealers with $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 in cash. So no doubt money is being washed through gambling. There is no doubt to that. I think it's about ensuring that there's appropriate safeguards for the New South Wales community, that government or police have the ability to access information to help us pinpoint and target these people. Because you could say, well, we don't want a casino, we don't want organised crime money being washed through that. But it's cause and effect. The casino's not causing that. If they had the appropriate people, rules, governance models in place, they could minimise that. But it's about how do we get the information about these individuals to help law enforcement better target the criminal groups perhaps that we don't know about.
Your contract runs out in March next year. 5 years that'll be. Is that it for you as Police Commissioner in New South Wales?
Well, it's gone quick. Most people say to me, oh, geez, you've been the Commissioner for a couple of years, I think, haven't you? And I go, well, no, it's been 4 years, and it has been an honour. And, you know, Andrew, I think one of the great challenge in making decisions as a Police Commissioner, you either go too soon or too late. There's not much room in the middle, and at some stage this year I'll have to make a difficult decision, not just whether I'm going to be the Commissioner, but whether I'm going to be a police officer anymore, and I've been a police officer for nearly 34 years.
Sounds like you're thinking of going.
No, not at all, but it's not the sort of job that you just stay because you're having fun, or I get on a great, you know, the Premier is such a great leader, and you know, the community is so supportive of me. You don't stay because it feels good. It's a 24/7 job.
That's a year before a state election. History shows that generally you get prevailed upon by the politicians or the Premier of the day to stay past the election. Are you expecting that?
Oh, look, I think my salary is pretty well known in New South Wales, and I'm not looking for a pay rise, that's for sure. And I just think it's about making sure my headspace is right for the community of New South Wales. It's not a selfish decision.
It's interesting you raised that, because you copped some flack for that, didn't you?
Oh,
you got a pay rise around the start of the pandemic,
yeah,
and you got whacked.
I did, and I can't walk into a pub without someone having a joke that's my shout based on how much money I make. But look, you've got to be resilient in these jobs, and you do take hits, Andrew, and you can't take these things personally. You just got to focus on the job.
Now, I wanted to ask you about a case that I guess has horrified the Australian community, and it's pretty haunting, really, the image associated with it, and that's William Tyrrell. Yeah. And I guess it must cause you some consternation as a Commissioner that remains an unsolved crime. Why is it still an unsolved crime?
It has been a challenging investigation, and I think it's one that has really played out in the media, in the community. But, you know, that image of him in the Spider-Man outfit is one that, you know, you probably never forget. It is with the coroner at the moment, so difficult to talk about the entirety of the case. But what I can say is that there's a Detective Chief Superintendent, Dave Laidlaw, who I would say is, you know, one of the best homicide detectives that I've ever met, has solved more cases than anyone that I know. There's a team of 5 detectives working with him and 2 analysts, and that has been consistent. And I cannot remember an investigation that is 6 years old and has had consistent strike force working on it, and they haven't given up.
Is there someone that police believe killed William Tyrrell? Is there a key suspect?
There are a number of suspects at this stage, and the investigative team haven't discounted anyone. But I tell you...
How many can you put a figure on that for us?
There would be more than a handful, obviously, that are of concern and are actively being investigated. And we are still...
Do you believe amongst that number is the killer?
I believed he was killed, and I believe that we can still solve it.
Gary Jubelin, I mean, that was a pretty messy situation, wasn't it? What happened there?
Look, I think from our perspective as a personal one, I finished on good terms with him, and I'll reiterate that he was an officer who invested heavily in the victim's family, and his work with victims' families is well known. And at the end of the day, he made a decision it was time to retire, and that's one that we all face, and he's moved on now. He's a journalist and seems to be doing well.
But ultimately he got fixated, didn't he, on a suspect. He was proven wrong, wasn't he? And he taped someone. I mean, how does that happen to an officer? I'm not after criticism of him, but it's a kind of a fascinating story, isn't it?
Well, I mean, part of that's been before criminal courts, and that's been finalised in theory, and part of that will be looked at by the current coroner, and it's difficult to comment on whether he had tunnel vision or not. I know he was passionately investigating it, and was he focused on the wrong person? And I guess, you know, it will be interesting to see what the coroner has to say.
Thanks very much for your time.
Thanks, Andrew.